All right, Bryan, the 2025 offensive line. And this is a really fun conversation to have because the expectations are going to be raised mostly
Oh, yeah.
because of a lot of what you have coming back. And it's a really awesome, really fun conversation to start having when you start diving into it. But we believe that the 2025 Notre Dame offensive line should be elite. And when you start having that conversation, you start diving a little bit into the why. Why do we believe that this unit has the opportunity to be elite?
Yeah. Well, the run, I mean, there's so many reasons why you're excited about it, Trev, and why you expect it to be good. And you look at last year's run game and in the last segment we talked about this issue and that issue but at the beginning we talked about talented and physical and all that, but the talent in the backfield's elite. And you're talking about a team that had their top 3 running backs average 6.9, 6.2 and 6.4 yards per carry. And oh, by the way, that other freshman you brought in, when you brought him in running behind the backup offensive line, averaged 5.5 yards per carry. You know what I mean? And Keedron Young, I mean, your running backs went over 6 yards a carry this season as a group. That's really impressive. But it's also, I mean, you saw enough from the offensive line to say, boy, if you can address some of the things we talked about, get the right people on the field before the injuries force you to put the right people on the field. Just make the same growth in the pass pro and in certain technical areas the way you did in certain areas with the physicality and footwork and leg drive and things like that were much better in year 2 compared to year 1. That's coaching. The players didn't figure it out. This wasn't like 2020 when, I told people, like, you want to know why the offensive line played so much better? It's because a bunch of those guys spent the offseason hanging out with Harry Hiestand. True story. And Chris Watt obviously was a GA on that team and spent a lot of time with Harry Hiestand and helped him out. That was the reason for it. The quote unquote blame or responsibility or whatever for the improvement this past season was because Joe Rudolph focused on those things, worked on those things, repped those things every day, and the play got better. That's good coaching. Now you need to apply that to the other areas. And if you do that, the thing you look at, Trev, and you're like, God, this offensive line is loaded. Let me ask you this question. If the offensive line going into fall camp, going into the season, was going to be left to right, Anthony Knapp, Sullivan Absher at left guard, Joe Otting at center, Chris Tarrick at right guard, and Gerby Lambert at right tackle, I'm not upset about that. That's a huge offensive line, a talented offensive line. And where you're not that big, center and left tackle, you're very athletic. That could be your number 2 offensive line this year. Like that's talent. You look at what the line may look like this year, whether it's Emil or Gerby or Anthony or Jagasaw or Tarek or Absher or Shrouth or Craig there's so much talent. Oh, and by the way, they're adding another 5-star freshman to the lineup this next year with Will Black coming in. There's so much talent, and Coach Hiestand started it, and Coach Rudolph is built on it. But it's very and not only built on it with some recent classes, but even looking forward. We talked about this when we broke down the 2026 offensive line class. They're clearly trying to get bigger, and you're going to start to see the fruits of that more so this season. But they're not so obsessed with bigger that they pass on a guy like Anthony Knapp, who may not be bigger, but he's strong for, not just strong for size, but just strong, period. And he's very athletic. So if the right guy's there, they'll take a smaller guy, but he better have some traits that you like. And Anthony certainly had that, which is why he had a lower grade coming out of high school for me, 3.5 star, but had 4.5 star upside. Because you're like, if the weight comes and he can keep the athleticism that he has at 270 when he's 295, this guy could be a dude. And we saw that to some degree last season. So when you look at it and you think of the talent they have coming back, it's hard not to get excited. And we saw a lot. This isn't even just any more like fictitious based on high school talent. We saw in games what Emil Wagner can do when he was on his game. We saw what Jagasaw can do, what Knapp can do, what Billy can do, what Ashton Craig can do. But we even got a chance to see a little bit of what these younger guys could do. I mean, they put the backup offensive line in the game with Gerby and Chris Tarrick and Sullivan Absher and Joe Otting, and they would run right down the field and put the ball in the end zone. I mean,
Yeah.
it was just like, and the other teams, and against Purdue, that was still Purdue's first team defense. They never put their backup defense on the field. And you're just like, dude, there's so much talent here. And now that there's also experience to go with that talent, there's great depth. It's hard not to get excited about what this offensive line can be when you think about size, talent, depth, and now even more experience. And why this matters is, look, you're going to need this offensive line to be better than it was a year ago. Number one, because you didn't win a championship and your offensive line struggled in your last 2 games, right? I mean, that's just the standard. The standards. You're Notre Dame. You ran for 53 yards in the college football playoffs, and a big chunk of that came on the first drive, and you could never replicate that again. You had your own mistakes. We talked about I did a breakdown of 2 run plays that would have gone for big plays. One got called back because of a false start by a receiver. The next one on a play that was 2nd and 25 might have gone for 40, 50 yards if the guard properly pulls. And Jadarian was waiting on him to pull too. Like you could see it. Jadarian was like, pop it, pop it, pop it. And then he didn't pop it. And then Jadarian was forced to pop it and with no lead blocker. And then he gets tackled for no gain. And you're like, yeah, Jadarian Price is no, that's on the freaking right guard. You could see Jadarian waiting on him, slowing down to let him get outside, and he didn't properly do it. You didn't play well enough in those moments. And that's not acceptable. And that's the standard at Notre Dame. And so you've got to get better there. When you look at it from the standpoint of you're going to have a first-time quarterback, really. And I know Steve started a game, but I don't care. Starting the Sun Bowl in El Paso, Texas against an Oregon State team who half their starters aren't even playing in the game, and they were just a solid team anyway, does not say, okay, he's ready to go lead you to victory over Georgia or Bama. Point being, not a shot at Steve, but like that experience does not prepare him for what will come as the full-time starter, because we all knew who the starter was going to be. He wasn't that. There was no pressure on Steve in the bowl game. They already had their starting quarterback. His name was Sam Hartman. He'd already signed with Notre Dame. You know what I mean? Excuse me, Riley Leonard. He'd already committed to Notre Dame. You knew who the starting quarterback was going to be the next year, and it wasn't going to be Steve. If Steve wins a job now, I don't care that he started against Oregon State. It matters what he does moving forward. And he's going to be a new starter with a completely different level of pressure on his shoulders than he had going into the Sun Bowl or coming off the bench with no time to think against Penn State, which was huge. He did great in those moments, but it's just different when you're the guy every single day. There's a different type of pressure when it's just all the eyes are always on you. If it's not him, it's Kenny Minchie or CJ Carr, who played a grand total of 4 snaps last season and threw a combined 1 pass last season. You're going to need your offensive line to carry them early. That's the other part of it. So it's to be a championship team, you've got to do this and play to this level, but you also got to do it to protect your younger guys. That's a big part of it as well. And if there is a chance your defense takes a step back, your offense can't pick up the slack if your offensive line doesn't play better next year than it did last year. And in my opinion, significantly so. Like very noticeable year 1 to year 2 improvement. And I think they did that last year. I think they played significantly better from year 1 to year 2, in my view, especially considering you didn't have Joe Alt and Blake Fisher to work with anymore. And then you go into year 3, I need to see another significant jump in year 3. And then hopefully it starts to kind of plateau, but it plateaus at excellence. They're not there yet. And that's what gets me excited. But it's not just that I'm excited about it, Trevor. It needs to happen if this team is going to reach its full potential. It has to happen.
We talked all season about Notre Dame being a rhythm-based offense and how it's inconsistent and a lot of that begins with the offensive line. I mean, there would be games where, even just the first half looked polar opposite from the second half, whether that started out well and ended poorly or started poorly and ended well. But you just go through and you look at the talent that they have bringing back. They have 5 offensive linemen who have starting experience in meaningful games that come back, between Emil Wagner, Anthony Knapp, Charles Jagasaw, Ashton Craig, barring that he's healthy enough to be playing meaningful minutes, potentially in the spring or into the summer and the fall. And then Billy Schrauth. I mean, you talk about a potential starting offensive line. Even if Joe Rudolph went with the safe, hey, we're just going to go with the 5 guys that started, that's a pretty decent offensive line. That's a really good offensive line. But then you start thinking about what's been waiting in the wings and the players that didn't. They played some snaps last year, but I'm talking about meaningful snaps and in moments in games where it was still in doubt. And it's bigger. I think that's crazy to me. I mean, in moments last season, Notre Dame puts in their second string offensive line and they got bigger. I mean, that is
you'd be 6'8", 320 at left tackle. They would have Absher often at left guard, who's 6'7", 320 something. Joe Wadding's 6'3", 295. Your right guard is 6'5", 330, and your right tackle 6'7", 325. That's your backup offensive line.
It's crazy. It's absolutely crazy. And you have those guys who've been waiting in the wings to start battling for spots. You have Sullivan Absher, who Notre Dame has listed at 6'7", 321 right now on their roster, battling it out for an interior guard position. You have Chris Tarrick, who's 6'5", 333. You have Gerby Lambert, who's 6'6", 323. Will Black is coming in. He's 6'7". He's probably going to be close to, if not over 300 pounds by the time fall camp starts. So, you go through and you look at what this team has coming back from a starting perspective and from a potential perspective. Not only do they have, to your point, the opportunity to be elite, they have to, because that's, one, the standard at Notre Dame, the standard that Marcus Freeman has for this program. But that was also the miss in 2024. They had moments where it's like, okay, this offensive line is really starting to put it together. But then sometimes even within the same game, you just kind of throw your hands up in the air and it's like, hey, what is going on here? But they're loaded. And when you have essentially 11 guys that you could trot out there that I wouldn't be upset that were in the starting lineup, it's got to be a pretty good feeling for that offensive coaching staff heading into the spring. It's got to be, man.
It does. It's like with anything we talk a lot about, Trevor. It's margin for error is so important in football. And especially with this era of 16 game seasons where you're having to go out there and I mean, you're just not going to be healthy for 16 games. It's impossible to be that healthy for 16 games. Somebody's going to not pan out. Somebody's going to get hurt. Those things happen to everybody. And if you're like counting on, if our starting 5 is healthy, we're going to be golden. But if we got to dip into our number 2s, we're in trouble. And that's been an issue for Notre Dame at most positions for a long time. And that's the position. And I was having this conversation with a friend of mine the other day, and he was talking about that as well. And it's like, we haven't seen this kind of depth from Notre Dame in a long time, where you can lose a Benjamin Morrison and replace him with a Leonard Moore, where you can lose, a Charles Jagasaw and replace him with an Anthony Knapp, who's a talented player, or, lose Ashton Craig and replace him with a guy that started 13 games the year before. Or lose a guy like you could lose Jordan Botelho and Boubacar and replace him with what? Josh Burnham and Junior Tuihalamaka. And, it's like most teams can't do that. Most teams can't do that. Most teams don't even have those kind of guys in their starting lineup, much less coming off the bench. And so, but the depth is so important, Trevor. And also from the standpoint of the competition. Why do I feel like Emil Wagner's going to make a big jump this offseason? Because I think he's a smart kid. I think he's a competitive kid, because he has to. Because if he doesn't, and you've got a good offensive line coach, and Emil just goes through the motions and thinks he's arrived and he's content being where he is, he's going to get beat out by a 6'7", 323-pound, former 5-star player in Gerby Lambert. How do I know that Anthony Knapp, when he gets back from health, is going to bust his tail? Because I think he knows if I don't, I'm not going to be starting. How do I know that Ashton Craig is going to be better when he gets back? Because, again, he's going to have someone there pushing him. And that's true across the board. And I think competition breeds excellence. But also, competition weeds out the guys that don't really have that winner's mentality. And you're going to really find out, does Emil have that? Does Billy have that? Does Knapp have that? Does Jagasaw have that? Those are, and then also it's not just the starters. Does Sullivan Absher really have that dog in him to where he's going to look and say, I don't care that they're bringing back X number of starters. I want to play, and I'm going to go out there and work like a guy that wants to beat one of those what's out. And then you go into the next one and you say the same thing about Gerby. What kind of dog does he have inside of him? I don't care that Emil's coming back. I want that job. And say I'm gonna play so well and work so hard that they're gonna have to figure out a way to get me on the field. That's what you want, and that goes with the first and second teamers, and that's what competition does. It weeds out some of the guys that really don't have that fight in them. And that's what excites me too. I mean, that's what's great. That's why, I mean, it's size, it's athleticism, it's numbers, it's talent. There's all these things that get you excited about what this offensive line can be, assuming they can make the improvements. But it all goes down to this, Trevor. Will Joe Rudolph allow this offensive line to reach its fullest potential? Not just from a coaching standpoint, but it's crazy that we have to have this conversation. But I think after the last 2 years, we have to have this conversation. Will he make the right decisions to get the best five on the field? And what does that look like? Does that automatically mean that he has to move Anthony Knapp away from left tackle? I'm not saying that. Does it mean he has to put Charles Jagasaw at left tackle? Does that mean he has to, bench Emil Wagner to put in Gerby Lambert simply because he's more talented, physically talented? No, I'm not saying that at all. What I'm saying is you've got to decide, number one, what gives us the best chance to put our best five out there for whatever reason. And what does that mean for certain players? Does it mean I'm going to keep Anthony Knapp at left tackle and spring ball, let him compete with Charles, see who the best guy for that job is? Because I think that it's more important that you let one of those two win the left tackle job before you move them to guard. I need to see one of those. I mean, left tackle is important. Make Jagasaw or Knapp win that job first in a fair fight. Once you kind of have an idea of whether it's after a week or 2 weeks, like, okay, Knapp's the guy or Jagasaw's the guy, or maybe even Wagner's the guy at left tackle, then you can say, okay, Jagasaw, let's just say hypothetically that Jagasaw, after a week of spring practice, let's say Knapp's back, after a week of spring practice, it's obvious that Jagasaw's the guy there. Anthony Knapp is good enough to where he deserves a shot to compete somewhere. And so then I'm like, okay, let's see what he can do, where Notre Dame originally recruited him with an eye on him playing inside. Does that mean you move him to right guard? Does that mean you move him to center, where you want to create more competition there with Ashton Craig coming off of an injury? I mean, Anthony Knapp is now a more experienced player than Ashton Craig. Way more snaps than what Ashton Craig has. He's not in the system as long, right? In the college as long, but he's played a lot more snaps. And then the other way around. If Knapp proves that he's the guy after a week, it's like, okay, Knapp's just taking a big leap and he's just perfect for left tackle. The issues he had last year, he's worked them out already. He's money there. Then you say, okay, now we need to move Jagas over to right guard and let him be that guy there. It comes down to that. Part of it's that. It's, hey, we owe it to Sullivan Absher to pick a spot for him and let him battle there. Like moving him to right guard or right tackle or left guard. I don't care where it is, but Sullivan Absher deserves to be able to play one spot for at least a time to show what he's got. It's about establishing your center depth chart, and then it's about creating honest competition, because you can't have a team motto of challenge everything, but then say, well, that guy, and that guy are guaranteed to start because what they did last year. Last year's over with. Now it's about who's our best guy this year. Am I saying that means you should bench Emil Wagner? No, but what I'm saying is there should be an honest competition at right tackle where Emil's got to show that he's going to grow on what he did last year. And then because it could go one of two ways. It could be a thing where if he has the jump that he has, like we had a question on the board yesterday, and it was, what's your ideal starting offensive line? And I posited, I gave my answer of what I thought it would be, but then I gave a what if scenario. What if Emil has a big jump this offseason, but Gerby Lambert also has a big time offseason? And Emil makes that jump, Gerby makes that jump, Jagasaw's a dude. Is there a scenario, say, we got to consider with Emil maybe moving him to left tackle inserting Gerby in the starting lineup at right tackle, moving Jags into right guard, and now it's Wagner, Schrouth, Craig or Knapp, Jagasaw, and Gerby on your – I mean, like, the point is, I'm not saying that's going to happen, but the battle needs to be allowed to be had to either say Emil's definitely the guy and that competition made him better, and now we're going to get the best version of Emil next season, or Emil didn't do what he needed to do, or it could just simply be Emil did everything we asked him to do, but Gerby Lambert's just too good not to play. Same thing at left tackle, left guard, center, right guard. A real competition needs to happen to where by trial by fire, right? Iron in, sharpen iron, and all these different expressions you want to use. That's how you got your starting five, because they battled and the five best had to emerge. And if that happens, then I feel good about where the offensive line is going to be next season, Trevor. I really do. Even without some of the things we need to see corrected by the offensive line coach. If those things don't get corrected at all, there will be problems at times. But you should be in such a better position next year where the talent can kind of, like, they didn't all of a sudden become better coached in the second half against Penn State. They just went from having a banged up veteran and a true freshman to a fifth-year senior that was 6'8", 320 and a 6'7", 330-pound elite talent. Coaching didn't change at all. It's just you had better dudes on the field, and you could then go run on. Think about it, rush for 100 yards in the second half against Penn State. So that's where I'm coming from, Trev. It's like if there's a real competition, whatever the results may be, as long as they make the right decisions within that competition, and I'm not even saying what they are. I'm not saying if it's not Jagasaw at left tackle, that means Joe Rudolph's not being fair. I'm not saying that. I'm not saying that if Anthony Knapp doesn't move inside, that's Joe Rudolph being favoritism to Anthony Knapp. I think there's some issues there, but that doesn't mean that end result is the only thing that it could mean is that. Let a battle rage. Let the five best emerge, then figure out where they all belong and make better decisions. If that happens, I'm very confident this offensive line is going to be really good. It's like Ashton Craig needs to win the starting center job again. He needs to not only beat out Joe Otting, but I think he should have to beat out Anthony Knapp. I think they should move Anthony Knapp into center and let him compete there, if not right guard. I mean, you see what I'm saying, Trevor? Like, that's where, I even thought of, like, what if there's a world where, like, they move Billy Schrouth to center? He played some center early on in his career and played it in some high school, a little bit in high school and in one of the All-Star games. The point is, there's so many options there. There's way too much talent for this offensive line not to be elite next season. And the only thing that could hold it back is you as a coaching staff. That's it. And that's what gets me excited about what this offensive line can be. But as we've seen, that at times that has happened. Trev, where the coaching did kind of hold it back a little bit with some of the decision-making they've made.
Yeah, unfortunately, you're right. The coaching staff did hold him back to some degree. And look, Notre Dame continues to recruit this position, this group, at a high level. So this is a new normal. This is a discussion that I fully anticipate us having next year. On February 18th of 2026, we're going to be having a very similar conversation. I don't know if it's going to be to the date, but I'd be shocked if guys like Will Black started this year, barring injury.
Yep.
We're going to continue to
this
have
guy's
these same
off to the NFL. That guy's off to the NFL. Let's see the battle rage. It's yeah.
And right now, for me, Joe Rudolph is kind of 0 for 1 in that stance because based on some of the personnel decisions that were made in 2024, this is going to be a new normal for him, for this offensive coaching staff, for this offensive line room. Now is a really crucial moment to see how are you going to start handling this, because it's not going to be as simple as, yeah, we're just going to have Joe Alt start again. Duh. But is it going to be that? Because now Notre Dame's in a spot where they might not just have a Joe Alt, which is a really fantastic spot to be in.
They might have a junior version and a sophomore version.
Right. Right. And so with all these spoils of riches along the offensive line, you're going to have to find a way to, one, conduct a healthy, fair competition in the offseason and follow through on that when the season finally comes.
Yeah.
because it can't be something where, yeah, this guy just outperformed so-and-so, player A at left guard, but we're going to start player F at left
Yeah.
guard.
Because
It's
he was
got to
there
be.
last year, or I
Mhm,
recruited him, or whatever. And again,
mhm.
we're not saying it won't happen. We're just saying what needs to happen. This
Correct.
isn't, it doesn't automatically mean, well, I don't think Joe Rudolph's going to do that, so I got to call him out and challenge him to do that. That's not what we're saying. I do think there's history of that not always happening, but we're just saying in general that needs to happen. It just needs to happen. They need to be able to do that and make those decisions. And if they can do that, then I'm very excited about what this offensive line could be. I mean, now there's some other things we talked about, Trevor. They've got to improve in pass pro. And they've got to, improve handling the line games. And there's, using their hands better, finishing better. I think there's definitely a level of finishing better that this line can have. That partly is going to be corrected with better hand play, but that's also sometimes a talent thing. Billy Schrouth, Anthony Knapp, even Joe Otting, who's hasn't done a whole lot, Chris Sullivan Absher, Christopher Tarrick, those guys are going to all, when they reach their senior years, are all going to be better finishers than Pat Coogan was. And that's not a knock at Pat. They're just better. They're just bigger. For most part, they're stronger. Just more powerful, I should say. They're more athletic. They're just more talented players. And so that changes partly with that, but there's also a level where improved hand play is also going to help them perform better in that part of the game as well. But so there's certainly some technical things that they return, but the talent is there for this line to be really good. It's just, will you let it happen? And then part of that too is you got to be healthy again. But I feel like you could lose 2 starters this year and you're going to be in a better place than you were when you lost guys last year. You're not going to replace them with 13 and 10 game starters like you did this year, which you have to take into account, but you're going to replace them with guys that are every bit as talented or as athletic and sometimes bigger in that case. But then the other part is, can he keep everybody happy? And that's been a room that each of the last 2 off seasons, I've heard a lot of grumbling about. They're just not being the level of, that room needs to be as tighter than any room in there. And it hasn't been last couple of years. And that needs to be addressed. And if it can get properly addressed and they keep everybody happy and on the same page and the communication is good and everybody knows exactly what's expected of them and where they stand and all that kind of stuff, then this room has the makings of something special. And it doesn't require you to fire Joe Rudolph, because you have to be able to look at Joe Rudolph and have an honest conversation with yourself. And this is what we talked about earlier. I feel like there's not a lot of people willing to have an honest conversation about Joe Rudolph. There's the people that just want to defend him and say, well, they average 200 yards a game. Okay, but why settle for 200 yards a game when they were capable of 230? Why settle for 5.7 yards a carry when they were capable of 6.2? Why settle for giving up X number of sacks when they were capable of only giving up X number of sacks? Why settle for what you saw when what it should have been was better? That's my point. I don't think what we saw this year was the best this line could have done, even with the circumstances that came up, even with the injuries and all the different things. There were still things that should have made this line better had the coaching done a better job. And it's okay to admit that. And that doesn't mean I'm saying Joe Rudolph sucks. It doesn't mean I think that Joe Rudolph is the horriblest coach ever. I use that word intentionally because it's a silly word for a silly argument. It doesn't mean I think he's Jeff Quinn. It doesn't mean that I'm hanging on to the Harry Hiestand legacy and I'll never let it go and no one can ever live up to Harry Hiestand. You don't have to live up to Harry Hiestand because it is not winning the Harry Hiestand award. It's winning the Joe Moore award. You know what I mean? And it's not even about living up to the Joe Moore standard. It's about living up to the Notre Dame standard and making sure that what does that mean? That means I'm getting the most out of my players. Sometimes that's going to look like 2017. Sometimes it's going to look like 2024, and that's the best they could be. Numbers-wise, play-wise, production-wise. My thing, however, is I don't think that's the best that this unit was capable of. And that's the point. Then on the flip side, there's the crowd of people that want to act like everything good that happened only happened because they have a lot of talent. And if it wasn't for Joe Rudolph holding them back, this would have been the best offensive line in the country. That's equally unfair. You can't look at the improvement of footwork and drive through contact, delivering punishment as opposed to accepting punishment, all those type of things. You can't look at those two. You can't look at the team that lost Joe Alt and Blake Fisher and Zeke Correll, who, by the way, was an all-ACC center this year for NC State. You don't lose those three players, and your numbers get better just because you're good at running back. Because let's not forget, they had a pretty good freaking running back the year before and still had Jeremiah Love and Jadarian Price in that lineup as well. Younger versions, but still talented. So you can't sit there and say, like, well, they did all this in spite of Joe Rudolph. There's things that Joe Rudolph did poorly this year. We've talked about them. There's things he has to get better at. We talk about them. And if you find yourself getting mad at me for saying that, look in the mirror and think for a second to say, okay, I'm allowed to hold the program I love to a higher standard and to say that it's capable of even better than the one it says without it becoming some sort of attack on the coach of the program. Being a fan does not require blind allegiance. It doesn't. It requires you to love your team no matter what. If you're a parent, when you scold your child or you put your child in timeout or whatever you do to create a level of punishment or to let your kid know that's not okay. We don't act that way in this house. Does that mean you don't love them unconditionally? Of course it doesn't mean that. Because you love them, you demand better. I'm not okay with you getting a C in math class because I know you're smarter than that, and I know that you spent all night last night playing video games. That's why you got a C. Sometimes you get a C and you're like, you know what, buddy? I'm proud of you because you busted your butt, and I know that's that's the best you're capable of. Not everybody is meant to be an A student no matter how hard they work, Trev. We all see it. There's kids that get A's and they slide through because they're just naturally really smart in the subject, and then there's that kid that studies day and night, round the clock, study cards, and he gets a C+. That's the best he can do. It's not about the result as much as did you get the best version of yourself, and if not, why? And when you're a fan of a team, because you love them, because you're loyal to them, you demand that level of excellence. And it's okay to do that, but it's also not about setting this absurd standard of perfection that no one ever can live up to because you liked the last guy better. And I think there's also some of that going on with Joe Rudolph where he's not Harry Hiestand, and so no matter what he does, it's never going to be good enough. Go out and win a national title and run for 250 yards. Yeah, that's because your backs were elite. They ran for 250 on the number one rush defense in the country who has 3 first-round draft picks in the D-line, and you're going to tell me they did that in spite of the offensive line? I know some people that will make that argument, right? The center ground, the more realistic area is Joe Rudolph did a lot of good things in year 2, but there's still too many things that are on him that need to be fixed and addressed before they can take that next big jump. I'm optimistic he's capable of it because I saw what he did from year 1 to year 2. It was impressive, some of the things that they did this year, especially when you consider the injuries and some things like that. But part of that was on him. Rocco should have never had to step into the lineup. He should have already been there. It should have been Strouth at left guard and Rocco at right guard and then Ashton Craig at center, and then there you go. That's what it should have been. That was your decision. It was a bad one. And you put Sam Pendleton in a really bad spot also. You set him up to fail. He wasn't ready for that yet. You didn't do him a justice by what you did. You didn't do Anthony Knapp justice by what you did with him. Not by starting him, but by putting a redshirt freshman next to him to start those games. Those are things he has to correct. And a proper conversation needs to be, he did some really good things. Some things got to get better. Pass pro technique has to get better. Being able to handle line games has to get better. That's a coaching thing. And you can't blame that on talent next year. It's a coaching thing. The players didn't get together and say, hey, here's who we think should start. You did. Make better decisions. So it's about accepting the job he's done, which has been good, and the growth that we saw, which has been good, and still saying, gotta be better, and you're capable of better. And that's where the conversation is. And if we hold Joe Rudolph to that standard, if Marcus Freeman holds Joe Rudolph to that standard, if Mike Denbrock holds Joe Rudolph to that standard, and more importantly, if Joe Rudolph holds himself to that standard, and they make those adjustments and those improvements, and he learns from some of his own mistakes, because any coach who doesn't look in the mirror and say, I should have done better, I could have done better, needs to find something else to do. Because every coach can do that, including Ryan Day, who say, hey, look, we won the title, but what can I do to beat Michigan next year? What did I do wrong to not let us beat Michigan this year? You should all be able to look in the mirror and say, what can I do to be better?
Yeah.
And if Joe Rudolph does that and then makes those proper changes, then this offensive line is going to be awesome, because the talent is there, the athleticism is there, the potential's there, the experience is there. What's funny is they're going to be a more experienced offensive line next year than they were this year, despite the fact that they may actually, in some cases, be a little bit younger than the projected offensive line. But if it's the guys we think it's going to be, I think it would be more experienced in every aspect. You could have 3 seniors in the starting lineup, a couple juniors, all those type of things. So those are all aspects of improvement that need to happen. And that's what I'm excited to see, is can he make those improvements? What he did from year 1 to year 2 gives me a lot of hope. It really does. Now it's like, okay, you improve there, keep building there, but now let's improve some of these other areas. And if they can do that, I think this offensive line can be outstanding with Joe Rudolph as the leader of that group. And not because they're in spite of him, but because of him, with him. And that's the key. Because if it's going to have to be in spite of him, then they're not going to be as good as they should be. They're not going to reach their full potential. It requires both player and coach to play at a high level. Yeah. And then it's up to Mike Denbrock to say, okay, this is what I expect of you. This is what I need from you. You got to get him better there. And that's what he needs to do. And that's what gets me excited. I'm genuinely excited about the – I'm not sitting here like, oh, my God, I think Joe Rudolph's going to blow it. I'm not. I'm actually really excited to see. I have some cautious optimism in certain areas because I want to see what he's going to do with certain guys. But it's also a lot more excitement about just, man, I can't wait to see what this offensive line is going to be and what it's going to look like and how good it's going to be. And that's where a lot of my optimism for next year comes. Because if the offensive line is as good as I think it's going to be and should be, then the defensive line is going to be better too. Because they're going to be going up against that every day in practice. Whew. It could be a lot of fun, Trev.
Yeah, and the list for optimism is endless. And I think you hit all the nails on the head perfectly. Joe Rudolph is going to have some things to build upon from 2024. I think that he has a strong foundation moving forward. But nonetheless, there are still some changes that we have to see. But listen, folks, that's going to do it for our preview of the Notre Dame 2025 offensive line. Lots of reasons to be optimistic. There are still some questions that need answered, but the depth and the talent and Rudolph's jump from year 1 to year 2 leaves a lot of room for optimism. Don't go anywhere. We do still have a mailbag. Bryan and I are going to go for about an hour, but before we get there, be sure to hit that like button, hit that subscribe button, hit that notification bell, share this podcast with your friends and family. We would really appreciate a 5-star review on whatever platform you watch this on. And all the conversations that we're having right now and some of the questions that I've seen submitted are currently going on over in the Champions Lounge on the premium message boards at boards.irishbreakdown.com.